I say all the time, I didn't come to Passive House actually from the climate direction. It's not that I disagree that this is an excellent way to address climate change. I came at it from a more practical, economic, and marketing sense.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavors of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. You can also check out our Reimagined Buildings YouTube channel for some great inspiration for both building new or renovating. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zach Semke coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
Welcome back, Zach.
Thank you. Yeah, I just had a nice little trip down to Crater Lake in Oregon, the Cascades, and also went to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival and saw the Three Musketeers with my kids and family. Yeah, it was fun.
Nice. Something a little bit different.
Yeah. How are you doing?
Well, it's springtime here, so officially the winter is over. Days are starting to get longer. Lighter earlier, starting to warm up a little bit, and some nice long sunny days, which is a big change and a welcome change for this part of the world, because we had an exceedingly wet first half of the year, and we're not quite sure what the summer's going to bring off the back of what has been a pretty hot summer in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, the hottest in 120,000 years, perhaps. Yeah. It's been a long time. It's been a hot one. Yeah. So summer's officially over for you. It sure feels like it. Yeah, the kids went back to school yesterday, so we've got a senior in high school now, and a seventh grader and a fifth grader, and wow. So they're still feeling, like they said they were dreading going back to school, but in reality they really have enjoyed the first day. So no homework this week. I think they're in the honeymoon phase, but no, it feels like it's switching over for sure. I love this time of year. It's like one of my favorite times of year. I'm not really looking forward to the winter, but that's a ways off. So I'm just gonna think about the present moment.
Yeah. And of course, lives are back, but we'll talk about that and let everyone know what's coming up at the end of the show. We've got a few interviews, some people that have met back at some conferences earlier this year. This particular one, I'm really excited about this organisation and some of the projects they're involved in with Shane Pollin. So before we get into that, we've got a few people to thank.
We do, yes. So a big thank you to our founding sponsors: 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingwe Architects, Glavel, Minitaire, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. And thank you too to our champion sponsors: Bewizo, Gradient, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, Proseco, and Source 2050. And a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And I should also say that this is the kickoff of season 4 of the Passive House podcast. So Thank you to these supporters for making that happen. Thank you to all our listeners for listening to these interviews. You make it possible for us. So it's been such a pleasure. And Matthew, this is your brainchild. So
when did the live start?
The live started the second week of COVID lockdown. So that was, I think, basically like the very, very beginning of April, very end of March of 2020. So yeah, we're well into our fourth season or fourth year of lives.
Yeah, and a lot of people have met as a result of that. Not just us, but people who have listened to and attended those weekly shows, and then got together in person, and even people who have been listening and connected with either some of our guests or other people on the show, which is great. It's exciting to see.
Yeah, it is. It's been amazing to be part of it. It's pretty cool stuff.
So I had the luck and the pleasure of sitting down opposite Shane Pollin at one of I think it was the conference dinner in Wiesbaden earlier this year in 2023. And we got chatting, and I kind of, he's quite humble in what he just said. Hey, I'm a property developer. As we got talking, I became very aware of just the scale and also the depth of his thinking and understanding, and interest in doing things a little bit differently as a developer. So Shane explains a bit of that in this interview, but just by way of introduction, he's the founder of PS Ventures, whose primary mission is to help design and develop buildings that are more resilient, more durable, and more efficient by utilizing building science and passive building principles. And it's great to hear a developer speak about that and the reasons why he thinks that's a good thing, but also talk about the business side and the benefits of that, and just being good business of providing not necessarily luxury, but just good quality homes for the people that need it the most. So here he is. I hope you enjoy my chat with Shane Pollin. So I have with me Shane Pollin, coming from Maryland. We met in Wiesbaden and had a great chat after the Passive House conference there. And I was very interested in some of the projects that you've been involved in, which I want to get onto. But first of all, tell the listeners a bit about your background. How did you get into doing what you're doing?
I guess I've been in real estate development now for probably about a little over 20 years. I actually graduated from law school and went into business for myself for a period of time, and ultimately ended up working with some of my family who were real estate developers, multi-generational developers, an uncle and my cousins. And primarily multifamily, but we were fortunate we did a little bit of everything. And my younger cousin needed some help growing his business and asked me if I would come work with the family business in real estate development. And I was happy to come in and help. And it really, the family was working on, again, multifamily primarily, but a variety of product types, but importantly, they were owners of the real estate for long term. And so from very early on, I was just looking at our development projects with a long-term perspective. And that ultimately led me to lead, and to building science more generally became my passion. And I've just been running with that as my interest for pretty consistent, I guess, the last 17 years of variety of projects. I've been fortunate to work on over those years, all with a focus really on increasing levels of sustainability, resiliency, high performance.
When some people explain their story, it makes it sound very easy that you just got into real estate development. Was it that easy? I mean, how do you go from graduate student to investing and developing real estate?
In my case, I was fortunate again that my own family is my great grandfather was also a real estate developer. He had emigrated from Ukraine, actually, came to Philadelphia as a plumber, actually originally, and during the Great Depression, he was chasing work and ended up in the Washington metropolitan area. Some of his developer clients asked him to come down, and so he was working in as a developer. My grandfather, my father was doing more single family work. not always, frankly, with success, but always seeing projects that we would drive through town in DC and say, like, your grandfather built that or developed that, or your grandmother. And so that was kind of neat. And I always grew up in a way with a positive impression of development, which I bring up because I think nowadays that's not always the case. I think it's sort of a running joke in my house that, at least half the time the villain in a show is usually the evil real estate developer.
Yeah.
But I didn't grow up with that mentality. I thought providing homes for folks and that was always something that was a source of pride. And so when I was, after I had my foray in business, which was an internet related company, and then I had an uncle who was also in real estate development, not in the same vein as my own family. I looked at it as a positive opportunity to go in and simply help a multifaceted small business. Development was part of what we were doing. That company was called the Duffy Companies, but they were doing contracting work, essentially the folks who had built apartment projects through the 60s and 70s, the family and the employees who were there for decades were now doing renovations on projects. And my younger cousin saw opportunity in saying, we've got guys and we're renovating projects, but we hire a lot of subs still, and subs to do work in the projects don't seem to care about the projects the same way we do. And so he wanted to expand the business and asked me if I would join, really a lot on that side, on just sort of growing the business and maintaining properties that were in the family's portfolio. And I was, fortunately, as a small business, we were able to make decisions and be involved in wearing a lot of hats. And I quickly evolved into leading the new development side of what we did. And it just made sense to me to be developing higher performance as a family and as a business that was focused on long-term ownership. Cutting corners and things wasn't going to do anybody good. We were the ones who were going to suffer if we cut a corner. We were the ones, if we built an energy inefficient building, that would pay the bill. And so I sort of ultimately brought my passion and interest in high performance green building to that business. And I was very fortunate to have some successes with early buildings in building higher than code minimum, better than code minimum buildings, and was able to run with that success, if you will. But fortunately with me, it was something I always was predisposed, I think, in real estate to like real estate, to have pride in building homes for folks, and then to have been fortunately given an opportunity with some family to go in and learn and evolve in the role. And then I was with the Duffy Companies for 17 years until only recently, where now I'm partnered with the Duffy Companies on the projects that I work on now.
You talk about some projects being more sustainable than others, but it sounds like energy efficiency, sustainability, or just buildings that perform well is a good business model for you.
When I was first learning about development and seeing, going out, and I'm a pretty voracious researcher. I like to educate myself, meet folks. It's how we met, right, at a Passive House conference. Yeah. And so I knew that we had an opportunity as a family, right, to have a piece of real estate that had been actually unsuccessful and was handed back. Our area in eastern Montgomery County, we're in Montgomery County, Maryland, went through a bit of a downturn after there was a naval base that was up the street, was closed during a base realignment and closure process. This piece of property came back to the family. We had to decide what to do with it. I was, new and working in the real estate development department. And we had made a decision that we would build a building for ourselves, that we would occupy it some for ourselves. And I was out, and I had come across LEED already at this point. This LEED was not required in our jurisdiction, but the idea of building high performance is something that made sense to me. Again, as a long-term holder, knowing the approach of the family. And so I found LEED, what were generally referred to as green buildings. And I went to my uncle and I went to my cousin and said, hey, we're building this new building. It was about a 50,000 foot office building. We were going to occupy half of the top floor as our new headquarters. We were in a building immediately next door at the time. And I said, like, hey, we're building this new building. We're going to occupy half of the top floor. I found this thing called LEED, and it's about building, more thoughtful buildings, higher performance buildings, or energy efficient buildings. I think we should build a green building. And they said, no, we're not building a green building. I mean, rightfully, I think, reluctant a little at first to understand what it meant. And, I got a lot of the sort of, same questions that I think most folks who are entering this, like, it does, show me where it's going to have a higher return. Do people pay more rent for those buildings? How much more is it going to cost to build those buildings? And so it wasn't necessarily at the time, I'd say the theme, and fortunately, my uncle, the family were always building high quality buildings. But they weren't as focused on the high performance, I'd say, aspects of the buildings and the energy savings and resiliency of those buildings. And so I had to, show my family and talk with them. And ultimately, I'm very fortunate. My family was very open to the idea, and I'm very persistent. And I said the things that we're talking about, that, it saves energy. And this was a full service lease that we were likely to get for the remainder of the building. We were going to be maintaining the building for the duration. We would be paying for the water on the building for the duration. And importantly, I think that the business case that I made was that I was looking to California, where LEED was already being required by jurisdictions there.
Right.
And so, we're in this, again, I mentioned Montgomery County, Maryland, and in Montgomery County fancies itself relatively progressive. And so I said, like, look, these buildings are coming to the West Coast. I think it's only a matter of time before our jurisdiction will be requiring this type of building. And we are long-term holders. As I mentioned, we might be occupying half of our top floor, but there's the whole rest of our building. Maybe we'll get, we're going to lease those spaces. Maybe we'll get a 5-year lease. Maybe we'll get a 3-year lease. Maybe we'll get a 10-year lease. And in any of those events, we're going to be back in the market trying to find occupants to lease our space after we finish this first round of construction. And so if the theory is correct that these are new buildings coming, these LEED certified buildings, and we are going to be owners of our building for many decades, our choice is relatively simple. Do we want to be the first of the new generation of buildings, or do we want to be the last of the old generation of buildings? Where we're competing with LEED buildings in the next renewal cycle. And my uncle said that was the winning argument.
Do you recall what it was that, because that's putting it out there, taking a bit of a risk. What was it that made you feel that was the way things were going?
I guess I was researching at the time, seeing that jurisdictions in California, and I'll say, I think much like what I see right now with Passive House in places like, Massachusetts, or what New York is doing in banning gas, there's certain trends that are very, clear if you're looking for them. And I'd say building higher performance buildings is a trend, whether it's by Passive House by name, or by certification, or it's simply the direction of building to build tighter buildings, to build buildings that have less thermal bridging and things like that. This is just, where things are going. And I felt at the same time previously that because LEED at the time, and again, I'm not a LEED apologist, but I think it is a good system to help compared to a bare minimum building at the time. Again, I was looking at this in 2006, I think, was the time when we were looking at our building and what to do with that. And it just made sense from my perspective. I say all the time, I didn't come to Passive House actually from the climate direction. It's not that I disagree that this is an excellent way to address climate change, but it's simply not the environment I came at it from a more practical, economic, and marketing sense. I think the problem a lot of times is a lot of the benefits are very difficult to quantify. How do you quantify comfort, right? How do you quantify resiliency? These things. But it made sense to me. And when I saw that it was being adopted in California, it seemed like, well, these buildings are just better buildings. They're more thoughtful buildings. This is a trend that we're seeing. And I thought that trend would likely come to, I think that the bottom line is, I think it was less than a year, maybe a year and a half after the time we made that decision before our own jurisdiction required LEED buildings, but we had predated it, right. which meant that we were early, in coming out with a building. And to finish that story, what happened was, this was again 2006 into 2007, we're in construction. We were building a speculative LEED Gold building in the eastern part of our county, which is not the most affluent part of our county. It's not where most investment had been made. We were very fortunate to be building the building without debt at the time. And, we're building into a downturn, and we had built this green building, and I had a big sign put up on the building that said, green building seeking LEED Gold. As our first building. But I was also active on a community group, Matthew, and the community group was about welcoming. I told you that the area had gone through some difficulty when this naval base closed. Well, the new occupant of the naval base ended up being the United States Food and Drug Administration, who was at that time, this is, years after the base closure, were building LEED certified buildings because the federal government was also an early adopter of LEED. So they were building LEED certified buildings up on this campus a mile up the street. And through my work with this community group, I became aware that the Food and Drug Administration was intending they were growing at a rate and wanted to bring employees over to the east part of the county near their campus faster than they were building buildings. So they made that they were getting too big too fast and decided they needed to lease some space. So they put out a request for proposals for a building to occupy in close proximity to their campus. And in one of the request for proposal provisions was a preference for LEED certified buildings.
Right.
But of course, since it wasn't required, there was only one LEED certified building within the vicinity. And of course, the brokers at the time, I was getting in big fights with them saying, hey, you got to compete with these other buildings. And I said, no, our building is not the same as these other buildings. And I had to go to my family, when I became aware of this RFP and say, hey, not only did we build a green building, but we can't move into it.
Right.
What do you mean we can't move in?
This fancy building that we built for ourselves.
Yeah, this fancy building that we built for ourselves. I don't think we should occupy a square foot of it to us or anyone, because the federal government is out looking for a building. It's not like anyone was really knocking our door down at the time. We were going into a recession. Yeah. And so we decided my family, they're big game fishermen. We decided to big game fish and finish the building and compete for this lease with the federal government. And we won. Right. We stuck to our grounds. We won. And we never occupied our new headquarters building. We were rewarded in our investment in a better building with a 10-year 100% lease. Wow. To that building. And fast forward, that 10 years has since passed. We had earned Energy Star certification on that building when it was finished. The lease renewed, I think it was about a year and a half, 2 years ago. We competed again. We maintained our Energy Star certification on that building. I changed everything of that building, Matthew, this is when I was learning. Yeah. I changed almost every system of the building. I changed the exterior wall to continuous insulation. I stopped, as Joe Stieberger said, sucking on the exterior wall. We had a plenum that was a return plenum. We changed everything other than basically the primary air conditioning system, which had been ordered so early. Right. But we remain very proud of this building, that it performed 10 years after its occupancy. We still earned, and as you know about the data sets in Energy Star, it's always harder and harder to maintain over the years as the buildings get better. We maintained it. And with a 10-year award, we recompeted 10 years later, and we won a 15-year award just a year and a half ago.
And is that LEED still just a preference, or is it a requirement for that federal agency?
At that time, it was a preference.
Yeah.
It was simply, and again, that's what the brokers were saying was like, hey, yeah, I know you got a LEED building, but it's not a requirement. It just says it's a preference. So they don't need to choose that. But I believed that if they were building LEED buildings on their own campus, that it was an important element and that we had a good building.
Yeah. And clearly they enjoyed being there. When did you first come across Passive House?
Probably about, I guess, maybe it was 2017. So after I had that experience with that green building, we then had some property it's called the City of Frederick, northwest of Washington, D.C. And I went to my family and I said, I think we should build green apartments. And at that point they said, sounds good.
They trusted you by this stage?
Yeah, right. That first success was important. And then we had good success. We had experienced excellent lease up. We got very high rents. And so I guess the answer to your question is I was always trying to build better and build upon my learning. And at one point when we were building, we built our new headquarters. We had never moved into our headquarters building. So we ended up building ourselves a LEED platinum headquarters that was platinum core and shell, platinum commercial interior for our Duffy headquarters, and a platinum retail space. But I still was wanting to build better. I was seeing, of course, I understood that LEED didn't mean you were going to get an energy efficient building because it was a point-based system and it's very broad. And so I went on I think it was in the summer of 2017, I went on a learning expedition and I attended 2 conferences. I went back to California. Actually, I went to 3 different things. I went to a zero net energy conference. I went to a living future seminar, like a day long thing. And I went to a Passive House conference that I think at the time was in Seattle or Portland, and just learned about it. And so I very early on actually learned about the push and pull between zero net energy and Passive House. I was completely ignorant as to that there was any issues between these two groups. But I've since come to appreciate that, to a Passive House audience, the idea that you could just slap solar on something and make it zero net energy doesn't make it a good build. That was not something that was on my radar screen. And I knew when I wanted to build better buildings, and when I saw Passive House, it was a system. There were already professionals who none in the East Coast, really, by the way, or almost none. So I had to work to pair a Passive House specialist architect from Seattle, Brandon Nicholson, with our local architecture firms, and put the two of them together to work on the Passive House projects that really I've been working on since 2017. And those are those projects I started in 2017 are the projects that are coming out of the ground right now. That first large scale project.
What was it specifically about Passive House? You looked at all those other tools or platforms. What was it that attracted you to Passive House?
In a way, the simplicity of it, right? The flexibility, right? That there are some metrics that we're trying to achieve, and there's some science. I like the science-based approach. I'm passionate about the science. Just we say now, as we're requiring some of the team members to get training in Passive House, and once you see it, once you understand what a thermal bridge is, once you understand the impact of air leaking through your building, you can't sort of unsee it or unlearn it. You're like, well, why? That is costing us either in comfort, it's costing us in energy, it's costing us in durability, it's costing us in resiliency. So I think the more I researched it, it just seemed we weren't the first people. It was a system, as you know, that was around in Europe. There weren't very many buildings of the scale that we'll talk about that we're working on, but the science is the same. There's some issues with taller buildings, but it seemed like it made a lot of sense from a science perspective, and there was support available to talk to people. They might not all be local, but to talk to people who were working on this type of building and could attest to their comfort and possibility.
Yeah. So tell us about the project that you got on the go at the moment.
Sure. Right now, very fortunate to be working on a project in partnership with our local, effectively the Affordable Housing Authority of Montgomery County. They're called HOC, the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County. And again, the same sort of story about high performance. HOC owned a property that was across the street from a lot of holdings of the Duffy companies, and they were looking to redevelop a 60s vintage buildings that were no longer particularly serving the needs of their residents. These were some deeply affordable units, and HOC wanted to redevelop. With the coming of the FDA, there was a new master plan for our area. It allowed increased density and had a chance to meet our neighbor. And I didn't know much about our Affordable Housing Authority neighbor. I assumed that they just simply focused on providing 100% affordable housing. But the more I learned that that was actually not what they want to do. They wanted to provide mixed use, mixed income housing. And when we, as the neighbor, said, well, can we show you a little bit about what our specialty is? Duffy at the time, we were a general contractor. We developed really only on our own account. We were not a fee developer. So this was just an opportunity because they own the property across the street, and we felt like we should probably be involved because it's impactful to our holdings. And so we sat down and invited them to come look at those green apartments that we had built in Frederick and said, this is what we do. And by the way, this is how much energy they save. And these are all the features of them. And this is how comfortable they are. And they were sold. And so that started a process of partnership. We tried to do an assemblage with the property adjacent to us. And ultimately where we are is a really wonderful project that is 2 buildings, 463 total homes in 12 stories for these buildings, separated by about a 650 space parking garage. And we've got some pretty ambitious sustainability goals for Hillendale Gateway. One building is 155 homes and others is 308. And we're going to try to achieve LEED Platinum, Energy Star, WELL, Passive House on both buildings. And then we're going to try to achieve zero net energy on the 155 unit, 12-story building. And we're doing that by borrowing the rooftop. As many of your audience probably knows, you don't usually see a 12-story zero net energy building because one roof generally cannot support 12 stories of consumption. But we don't have only one roof. What we made a decision is that rather than both buildings being exceptional buildings and failing, if you will, to achieve zero net energy, we instead decided to dedicate all of the sites renewable to one of the buildings. That building is focused on providing homes to a senior population. So the whole project in that way is supporting the senior building, if you will. That building will be all utilities included. So there were some technical benefits of doing it this way with a single master meter against which to put all of this over megawatt of solar. And so, we've been working on it for many years. Again, as I mentioned, when we started this, we didn't have the professional expertise close. So Brandon Nicholson, fortunately, has followed his wife to be closer to her family, or the family moved to Pittsburgh. So he's closer. He's only maybe 4 hours away now, but we speak often. And we've got a team of folks that we've assembled from really all over the country, including Sean Armstrong, who's a specialist in electrification, who I met at that very first Zero Net Energy conference when he was heckling the gas company executive up on the stage. We've got Emma Raymont, who you've interviewed before, I think, on the podcast with McGran. And so we've assembled this team with these very ambitious goals.
It is ambitious, and combining all those certifications plus all the technology involved sounds expensive. Are there concerns? I mean, Housing Opportunities Commission, I imagine, is not an abundantly wealthy organisation. How do you get around the cost of a building like that?
Well, so first of all, and unfortunately, I've been asked to speak on this topic before, sort of high performance, what we're doing. And I say, as a long-term holder, it's not just about first cost. So the first thing to understand is that both the Duffy companies, PS Ventures, so after the transition, I mentioned a few years ago, after 17 years with the Duffy companies, my business is called PS Ventures, which stands for Passionate and Sustainable Ventures. And so Passionate and Sustainable Ventures comes at projects with a long-term approach. And so the first thing is that we're not exclusively focused on first cost. That said, as I mentioned, like when I was working with Duffy, I always had to demonstrate that the projects made sense. This was not a philanthropic effort or a purely environmental effort. But what we had was the ability to sort of have the commitment first. And I was confident that we would show, whether it was through utility incentives, whether it was through local jurisdictions incentives. In Frederick, if there wasn't an incentive, we went and met with the local politicians and said, hey, all these other jurisdictions have incentives. Why don't you have incentives? Working with, impact fees associated with water. Hey, look, we consume half the water. So we would do what we could to pull together all resources to devote to savings. And a bit, in our jurisdiction, we have relatively high taxes in our area. While that's not a benefit to the Affordable Housing Authority in the private sector, it really is. And so our jurisdiction in Montgomery County had a high performance building tax credit, right, to abate your tax credit for achieving certain sort of. So we did all this between that and then owning the property, so paying for the utility bills. I was always able to show after we had done that. I mentioned I've been fortunate to work on a variety of projects, including a hotel. We built, I think, the 7th LEED Platinum rated hotel in North America, and the first flagged, meaning like a Hilton, Marriott, which was interesting to try to convince them that they want everything a Big Mac to be a Big Mac to be a Big Mac, and when our Big Mac had some extra cheese, and actually they didn't want our Big Mac. We have solar, as long as nobody can see your solar on your hotel, So I always had to come at it, though, still from does it make sense financially? And fortunately, I've been able to show that while there might be a first cost premium, that first cost premium, it's not a question of cost, it's a question of value. And that from a value perspective, it makes sense. And so each one of my projects, often, again, we have that commitment first, and it's often in hindsight. I mean, we evaluate every decision financially before we do it. But really, at the end of the day, you can build the whole picture. But even for Hillendale, when we modeled it, I think we're modeling about a 5% premium in hard cost to achieve these ambitious goals, plus or minus that number. But Matthew, I like to point out all the time, where is the best of the thing and the average of the thing? Where's the delta only 5%? Where do you see? Can you buy the best shoes for only 5% more for the regular shoes, or the shirt you're wearing, or anything? Car? No. Jewelry? No. I mean, look around, anything that you see, the best of them. And I would argue that Passive House is among the best. It's a readily available standard. And I think that people knee-jerk reaction think like, oh my God, how much more is this going to cost doing all those things? We say, yeah, even if it is a high cost. And it's true. I think that the more experienced your team, the different, price. This is the lesson I learned on the first project. We had an inexperienced team, and it was more the soft costs that were the challenge. It also depends on what you're building. Like if you're building a Class A property or property of high quality, which Duffy was building high quality, HOC builds high quality. If you're already building high quality, then it's sort of like, what's the cost of that bag of groceries? I don't know. It depends on what's in the bag. I mean, if it's full of filet mignon and shrimp, that bag of groceries might cost more. If you made some wise decision, we got some peanut butter in there, and we do have some fish, and it depends. But I'd say that when we modeled it, we're talking about a plus or minus 5. The issue is that the buildings are very costly to build. Buildings are more expensive than your shoes or your shirt or your car. And so the number gets, I think, scary to folks, but it's not because it's like on on a percent basis, because it's unreasonable. And particularly, again, when I come back to the fact that how do you value resiliency? How do we value that? So HOC put a value on things like when, again, we have a mixed income project. And so we've got folks making anywhere from 30% of area median income all the way up to market rate. And to those of limited means, finding alternative forms of housing when the power goes out and your house gets really hot or really cold, maybe you or I or a lot of the audience might, call a family member, you go pay for a hotel room, go out and run out and buy a battery powered something. Like those are not as free an options to folks of limited means.
Yeah.
And so when you have HOC who's really caring about the residents and saying, well, when we see what happens now in places like the Pacific Northwest, where it got really hot when it wasn't normally hot, when they don't have a lot of air conditioning, buildings got hot, buildings got uncomfortable, people got sick, some people died in the heat wave in Dallas, right, where it got unseasonably cold. Right, just a couple years ago, where it got cold, power, they lost power, buildings got cold, people got uncomfortable, people were hurt. Unfortunately, people lost their lives. And you start valuing some of these, saying, well, what can we do? As I said, I didn't come at this from the environmental perspective. I'm not an environmental designer. I believe the science, and I believe this is a good way to address climate change. But many in the development community don't want to hear about that. And so my approach generally is to say, look, I don't want to get into a debate about what's causing climate change. We see weather doing strange things. We see weather getting hot. We see weather getting cold. Do we think that is the better approach to try to change the weather, or is the better approach in the short and immediate term to build buildings that can be more resilient to the weather? That when the power goes out, HOC doesn't have to try to rehouse hundreds or thousands, 1,000 occupants.
Yeah.
How do you value that, right? It's not in a pro forma, but because we've got a very forward-thinking, evidencing by leadership, Affordable Housing Authority, they're willing to make what are ultimately modest investments to try to make more comfortable buildings, more durable buildings, more resilient buildings. And I'm very fortunate, right, to be in a position at PSV to be leading this effort with HOC, because it really takes their leadership and investment. These are very, expensive buildings, as you can imagine. Again, not because they're passive house buildings, but just because it's expensive to build everything nowadays.
Yeah. That's some really good stuff there. Hey, we better finish up, but this is a really exciting project. I think we're going to have to follow it because what's the build timeline for that one?
We're just breaking ground now, and I think it's a 41-month build that's currently on the schedule. So that's what we're aiming for.
Yeah, but it's going to have a huge impact to what's that, over 400 houses. So it's going to have a massive impact, and
we're going to show how to do it. I hope to a lot of ways for folks who say that it's technically infeasible, or how can you do it? What choices did you make? Hillendale Gateway, and there's a sister project that's about 800 homes in 3 buildings that will follow on. We're going to show and learn from ourselves and learn from others that at least one way of building better buildings.
Awesome. Hey, well, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate catching up again, and look forward to watching the progress.
Thank you so much. Let's keep in touch.
Shane Pollin there, who is principal and founder of PS Ventures. What do you think, Zach?
Well, I'm a huge fan of Shane, and I have been for several years. So it was a real pleasure to hear this interview, and it's just always so encouraging to hear from a developer like Shane. And I we were talking about it before we started recording, but also just how it's always really validating to hear the business case for Passive House communicated to us by somebody who actually knows the numbers really, really well, and is looking to create value and smart and make smart investments. So really great interview. So fun.
Value is one of the key concepts that Shane talks about, and he has talked about in previous presentations as well. I know that he was involved with the Passive House Network in California, and presenting there. One of the things that he did talk about during that, and continues to talk about, is the idea of best value instead of first cost. And this is often the argument from developers or building owners, whoever's financing a building, is to say, well, how much extra is it going to cost me? And they're talking about the upfront cost. But the business model that Shane has allows him to think much more long term and say, well, what is actually the best value of that for that building over the life of it, and for the occupants, and therefore, if it's a long term rent type arrangement, then that's good business sense for that company as well. So, it makes a lot of sense. I understand that's not easy for people to get into that. It does require a bit of capital to get into that situation where you can develop and hold a large asset like that. But to have, like I say, developers who are thinking along those lines and see it not just for the benefits that it has the occupants, but also just good business, I think is fantastic. So really, really grateful for Shane to be doing his work and willing to talk about it and share it.
Yeah, and that his discussion of first cost, also the challenge that he was making of like what other object or commodity, or do we complain it, like for most things, the shirts or the cars or everything, the difference between a conventional version of that and the best version of it is the difference in upfront cost is not usually 5%. It's considerably bigger than that. And I think that's right on. I mean, we can get make such a massive improvement in resilience and comfort and health and carbon impact with a relatively small investment on first cost basis. And of course, because he's holding on to these buildings for decades and decades, he's looking far beyond the first cost question.
Yeah. And that was a strong theme in Sydney Passive House Conference earlier this year, the Thrive Conference, which we were both involved in. And I've heard it since then a number of times, the idea that the bulk of the cost of any building is the building, regardless of whether you do lead passive house or some other what is perceived as extra. It doesn't have to be extra, but that's how it gets seen, because it's often an add-on, which it shouldn't be. It should be integrated in the design, and then it might not cost you anything. But you're still going to need floors, walls, windows, doors, and everything else, and possibly some plant in there. That's where the vast majority of the cost is. To your point about, it might be 5% extra if you have to up-spec the windows, but you're still going to need windows, and there's the 90% of that cost is still going to be there. And I think that's quite a useful way of framing the upfront cost, is saying, well, as a investor, owner, developer, whatever, those costs are going to be there. So you don't complain about the 2 to 5, or maybe it's even higher than that. Maybe it's 10, 12% extra, without having a look at the other 90% of your cost.
Yeah.
And I've seen, there was another post today. It was a different situation, standalone house, but someone was sort of talking about the cost of housing, as we love to do. And the image they showed, which is a typical house out in the suburbs, was such a prime example, because it had a ridiculous number of corners. Like it had looked like it had been literally designed by AI, or at least designed by a computer program. And the roof just had so many ridges and troughs in it that if you take out all of that unnecessary complexity, you can still have a nice architectural look, but simplify the overall design. I guarantee that in a lot of cases, you could actually bring that bulk of the cost down, allow you to put in better windows and a good ventilation system, and you'll have a much better performing house, probably at a fairly similar price than the stupidly designed one that you started with.
Right. And probably lower embodied carbon too. Like all those zigs and zags mean more structure. We know that most of the embodied carbon in a building comes from the structure. Yeah.
we see that. I mean, that's the next sort of frontier, I think. And you know, Shane, as they get more and more down the path of, okay, we've kind of got the operational energy figured out, and that's the operational carbon. Okay, now let's start looking at what we're building these buildings out of. And while that's not required in Passive House at the moment, it sort of opens that door to be able to start looking at that and saying, well, you know, how does timber stack up versus steel and concrete over the life of the building?
Yeah. You know, that reminds me of another really important theme I thought that Shane was bringing up, and I think has been a driver of his success in all of this, has been that this notion, and he didn't use these words, but the notion of like skating to where the puck is headed, to you know, use the Wayne Gretzky, Wayne Gretzky phrase, right? And there's and so he was, I think there were brokers who were challenging him, I think, thinking that he was being too risky in investing in that lead building back at the time, you know, just as the government was just starting to incorporate lead into all their building, right there, that seemed risky to them, but Shane had, you know, saw the writing on the wall kind of, and understood kind of where things were moving. And I mean, I think he makes a case for it. Like if you just kind of cling to the status quo, that actually can be considerably more risky than understanding where things are headed. And it sure feels like we're at a time, at least in North America. I think this is true everywhere in different ways, or most places in different ways. But in North America, it sure feels like the puck is headed toward passive house in so many markets. I mean, that's true. Like Massachusetts, it's becoming code. New York is tethering its climate action goals in buildings along with, you know, to passive house in many ways. We're just seeing, and Washington State Energy Code is supposed to be headed toward passive house levels of energy performance by 2031. There are all these places where that's the case. And so Shane continues to be kind of on the forefront of seeing where things are moving. And as a developer understands that that's really important for the bottom line and for the value to maintain value in these buildings when that inevitable turnover of tenants happens in whatever 5 years or 10 years or whatever, as he was discussing. So it's I think just a nice like validation, I think, for what everybody in this community is doing, which is, I mean, sometimes we're on the bleeding edge. It feels like we're on the bleeding edge of this movement. But it was just a nice reminder that there's clearly a lot of momentum going in that direction, and really smart, successful developers who get the money part are recognizing that.
It's such a great example of build it and they'll come. I mean, they built a building for themselves and never got to move into it because by the time it was finished, there was such a demand for that type of building. And I don't know of any passive house projects that, that people don't want to be in. So,
right. Right.
But yeah, I can also understand that there's a risk. It's high risk, high returns. But it's also a case of influencing the right people at the right time. You've got to change the minds of the people who are holding the purse strings, and just get them over the line. And also often as we've heard with many cases, you only have to do that once or twice. Once you sort of do it once, and there's proof of concept through an experience, then you can rinse and repeat. Even small architecture firms find that it's the getting the first project over the line is often the biggest challenge. And once they've done that basically becomes their marketing, and then everyone wants one who hears about it.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, look forward to seeing that. There'll be plenty of time for updates because there's a pretty big long
3.5 years
build program for. These are big projects, which is also really exciting. So we'll keep checking in with Shane and the team there, and see how that project and some of his other projects progress in that time.
Yeah. I got a glimpse, an early glimpse of this project back, I think it was 2017, 2018 or whenever, because I was actually working for Brandon Nicholson at NK Architects for a couple of years here in Seattle. And so when Shane mentioned coming to the conference in Seattle, that was the FIAS conference that happened. And I got a chance to meet him there. And so it was so cool to see Brandon land that job with Shane. And I think it's become kind of a really kind of important kind of life's work sort of project. And, I think by the time it's done, it will be almost 10 years, which is the way these bigger projects happen.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Very good. We haven't done this for a while, but you got some stuff coming up.
Indeed. So Passive House Accelerator Live is back. Nice. As we're recording this, just yesterday, we had our first 101 session of the fall, and that was with Sean St. Amour, who everybody listening probably knows well from all the programming we do at the Accelerator. And he presented about airtightness. A reminder that we do a live program every Wednesday. The first Wednesday of the month is a Passive House 101 session. The second is a next gen session where we hear from a next generation leader in Passive House. And so this next week, we're going to be hearing from Linnea Kreutzer about her passive voyage. So Linnea and her mom, Simone, who is a longtime Passive House practitioner in Sweden, just went on this really epic journey throughout Europe, visiting a whole, like dozens and dozens of Passive House projects, sleeping in a Passive House every night, visiting Passive House related manufacturers. So she's gonna tell stories and share stories from her voyage in this next live. So that's the second Wednesday of the month. Third Wednesday of the month is Project Showcase. Fourth Wednesday of the month is Construction Tech. All of those are actually Thursday for you down under. Early in the morning for New Zealand and ridiculously early for Australia.
Check out the replays. Always available on replays. And those 101s, fantastic. I have to keep reminding people that just because you know what a blower door is doesn't mean your clients do. So there's some fantastic resources in those 101s to share with potential clients and other people in the industry to get them up to speed.
We're finding that the 101 sessions have a great mix of folks who are experienced practitioners, but also lots of new faces. Lots of new folks are attending those. We had like 170 people there live yesterday. It's really successful. It's fun. And Sean is just such an amazing presenter, really, really successful. So good stuff.
Awesome.
We are, in a couple of weeks, we'll relaunch the video production from Reimagine Buildings. So we've been in pre-production mode for the fall and have some exciting stuff coming up. I should also say that when people listen to this, when it hits the airwaves in podcast land, this episode we will have just surpassed the 300,000 downloads mark for the Passive House podcast. So congratulations.
Go us.
Yeah.
Yes. I should just do a shout out as well for Passive House Institute New Zealand has their Hui coming up, which is sort of a member event. It's a great time for people kind of in the community to get together and chat. So that's coming up 16th of November. Registration is open for that, and it will be in Christchurch. So people can check that out over at passivehouse.nz. And also check out, well, I guess, as we say, all affiliates, check out your local affiliate resource for what's coming up in your area, because there's so many events happening. We can't list them all right now because that would take us another half an hour. But yeah, check out your local Passive House group to see what's coming up in your part of the world.
Yeah, Passive House Network Conference in Denver in October, FIASCon Conference in Houston in November. So
nice.
We'll include links to all that.
Very good. All right. Well, great to have you back. Zach, and sorry that your summer's over, but looking forward to getting stuck into some more great content. We'll be back again next week on the Passive House Podcast.